Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Michele Lancione, and I am one of the directors of the Beyond Inhabitation Lab. This is a lab that I co-direct with Abdulmalik Simon, and it's a lab that aspires to provide an infrastructure for collective study around matters of inhabitation and housing struggles and matter related to these kind of things. So today we have a good group here in the room in Turin and also online, because we are welcoming our dear steering committee member and friend Erin McElroy. So welcome to Turin, Erin. I am just going to briefly introduce Erin and their work, and then they will speak for about 45 minutes. Today's presentation from Erin is entitled Becoming and Unbecoming Silicon Valley Techno-Fantasies and Frictions in Post-Socialist Time. So before actually reading the little bio from Erin, I just want to say that I am a great fan of their work, and Erin has shared a number of things in the past few years with a number of us, including co-founding the Radical Housing Journal, and also becoming a member of our Beyond Inhabitation Lab. I also had the great privilege of reading the forthcoming book from Erin. This is a book that is going to come out for Duke University Press in spring 2024, right, Erin? Yeah. So I very much look forward to that book, which is going to be very much about what Erin is presenting today. Now, Erin is assistant professor of American Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. Their work focuses upon intersections of gentrification, technology, digitality, empire, and racial capitalism in the US and in Romania, alongside housing justice organizing and transnational solidarities. This informed the focus of a forthcoming manuscript, Silicon Valley Imperialism, for Duke University Press, which I have just mentioned. Erin is also a co-founder of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is an amazing project, which produces counter maps and digital media for housing justice, and additionally runs the Anti-Eviction Lab at UT, where much of the research focuses upon producing collective knowledge about landlord-driven surveillance technologies. And Erin also has published numerous peer-reviewed articles and public scholarship pieces, and is also, as I mentioned before, one of the editors and co-founder of the Radical Housing Journal. Okay. Yeah, this is Erin. So now I am going to share the screen, and we will get straight into Erin's presentation for today. So let me make it big.
And is it, should I turn this on, or is it on?
It's already on.
Okay.
Yeah.
You all can hear me okay? Okay.
So, yeah. Thank you for being here, Erin, and yeah, the floor is yours.
Great. Just slide. Now, thank you so much, Michele, and thank you to everybody here, and especially everybody who's a part of the lab. It's been really amazing to be able to be here and meet so many of you after meeting you on Zoom calls over the last year or so. And of course, some of you I've known for a really long time, so it's great to be here in person. Yeah, and I'm really honored to be able to share some of my work today. Like Michele said, I'm going to be presenting a lot from a book project that's now in production with Duke. And so if it's horrible, you can blame him, because he actually is one of the few people who's read it or drafted it in its entirety. But I should also say that a lot of my thinking that informs it is based upon ongoing conversations with Beta Popovich, who's right here. So also, I'm a little nervous to present it, because you might be telling me that I'm getting so many things wrong. But a lot of it's based upon lots of conversations that we've had over the years, particularly parts of it that involve research in Romania, which much of it does. So I'm going to be reading.
This is the Polytechnic University. Yeah.
Okay.
It won't happen again. It usually
No,
happens
it's
once,
fine.
but-
It's there's a little bit about surveillance in here, so maybe it's like a yeah, so I'm going to be reading from different parts of the book. It's not going to be one chapter. I'm not going to give you kind of an overview chapter by chapter of everything that the book does, but really what I want to do is home in on what I'm describing as practices of both becoming and unbecoming Silicon Valley, in mostly in Romania, but also a little bit in the US and California, in what's considered the San Francisco Bay Area or Silicon Valley. A lot of it is based upon ethnographic work and interdisciplinary reading practices that I have been a part of and that I've conducted mostly between 2013 and 2019. I should say that it takes what I'm considering a post-socialist approach that's decidedly transnational, and that reads post-socialism not as a simple spatio-temporal marker of state socialism's end in Eastern Europe, but rather as a theoretical concept useful for marking the cessation of state socialism as a dominant discourse overdetermined by the Cold War and its kind of forms of knowledge production. So for me, I'm thinking about post-socialism as an exploration, or basically as an analytic that allows an exploration of anti-capitalist legacies on multiple scales within, but also beyond the state, that continue to inform radical imaginaries of collective action today. And I should also preface that I'm not using what a lot of people call a comparative framework. So I'm not comparing two spaces side by side. Certain scholars have noted that that sort of comparative framing can sometimes reduce one place to another, or sort of uphold Western normativity. So I'm not doing that, but rather I'm employing what I'm calling a connected approach, which traces different entanglements across time and space. And here I'm thinking alongside and with Ananya Roy, who writes that for some time now, poor people's movements have maintained an imagination not of comparison, but rather of transnational thinking and global interconnectivity. So in this way, a connected approach remains rooted in community organizing and internationalism alike, and centers both as entwined fields of inquiry. So that's just a little bit of a, okay. So I'm going to dive into what this project is about. And for me, it really begins by situating how cities such as Cluj in Romania have gained fame for having become the quote unquote Silicon Valley of Eastern Europe in recent years, really over 10 years at this point. And this is a toponymy that indexes novel shifts in technoculture, urban life, and aspirations of Western recognition. Outsourcing firms pepper urban centers. New co-working spaces are being built upon the ruins of socialist era factories, and context of tech-driven gentrification augment. So I'm suggesting that this process invokes what I describe as Silicon Valley imperialism, which for me is a global condition in which Silicon Valley's existence is necessitated by its unending growth, in which it devours people's intimate lives and personal data, while also consuming global and even outer space imaginaries in novel ways. And so I suggest that Silicon Valley imperialism deploys what I describe as racial technocapitalism, which for me is the technocapitalist imperatives undergirding racialized processes of data, land, and housing accumulation and theft. And here I'm also drawing on Cedric Robinson's work and his observation that capitalism has always been constituted by racism, and actually he traces this beginning within Europe's borderlands, including in what's now Eastern Europe. And so engaging these twin concepts allows for a decentralized analysis of race, space, and technology. They highlight how in Siliconizing times, it's disproportionately racialized residents that get banished to peripheral wastelands and includes to interstitial spaces squeezed between the urban and the rural. So I'm gonna just show you, oh, should I admit? Okay. Okay. So a lot of my interest in this began in Cluj around 2010. There was a really big mass eviction there. Some people here know it very well. And there were lots of different, factors that contributed to this mass eviction, which led to over 300 people, most of whom were Roma, being banished from their homes in the middle of the night in December. And one of the many things that we can look at as a factor into their displacement was the landing of Nokia a couple years earlier in 2007, actually the year that Romania joined the EU. Nokia decided, the Finnish tech company decided to relocate a German factory to the outskirts of Cluj, to this neighborhood that was pretty industrial, working class. And a lot of people in Romania and in Cluj were very excited about this. It sort of indexed this newfound way that Romania was going to gain Western technology, but also create jobs. And this was happening right around the time of the recession. But it also sort of triggered this idea of Cluj becoming the sort of new Silicon Valley of Europe. And while the factory was built and actually jobs were created, they didn't last very long because Nokia decided to relocate that branch to China to gain new tax breaks. But in that process, they decided they wanted to build an office downtown, sort of a white collar, high-end office building. And where they wanted to build this was exactly where the eviction happened. And we also have to look at some other industries. And then now the Orthodox Church, which reclaimed the space, also the railroad company wanted it. But Nokia was part of this in the beginning. And so for me, I often think about this as this pivotal moment in which racial banishment coincided alongside these new sort of aspirations of Western techno-capitalism. But that's not the only reason why the eviction happened. And another is this phenomenon of property restitution, which again, both Beta and Michaela have written about, and too, many people here. But essentially, this is this process that takes place in post-socialist context in which property that had been nationalized mostly in the early years of state socialism become reprivatized in its aftermaths. And one of the things that often happens with reprivatization is evictions. And then we have to kind of understand that there's a long history too as to why and how it's disproportionately Roma residents that are getting displaced when restitution evictions take place. And so for centuries now, lands comprising Romania, Roma were made property of the state, the church, nobility, and wealthy boyars or landowners. Given that many Roma were highly skilled in various craft-based professions, their labor often supplied the coffers of the wealthy. And in this way, while slavery served as a technology of capitalism, Roma technological labor made property ownership a lucrative business model. And so while Cedric Robinson, alongside other scholars of Black Marxism, positioned capitalism as an inherently racial project, which it is, it's interesting that other Marxists, many of whom don't look at race, suggest that we have to really look at innovation and technology as the genesis of capitalism. And I'm not going to get into all these debates, but I think it's actually important to note that sometimes these processes go hand in hand. So racialization takes place actually through technological exploitation, and that was the case and continues to be the case in Romania, but also many other places. And so I'm not going to get into all these debates here and all these different threads of Marxist thinking and the different infighting that takes place within schools of Marxism. I do find it actually interesting that in Capital, he compares the exploitation of the US factory system with that of prior peasant appropriation in Romania. And he actually describes these boyars drunk with victory. But he was, of course, hazier regarding the role of racialization there, with Roma people subjected to slave conditions for 500 years. So these contexts have, of course, resulted in an array of violences, including poverty, segregation, banishment, forced assimilation, and eugenic technoscience. The latter specifically racialized lack of property ownership and nomadism in newfound ways, materializing genocide for many. However, after Romania's plunge into fascism and the massive death toll that it brought, state socialist policies of housing nationalization, alongside labor-intensive jobs in heavy industry and agriculture, provided relief for many. And then all of this gets eviscerated in post-socialist contexts of property restitution, sped up by fantasies of siliconization. And so I'm getting into all of this to say that while one might assume that racial techno-capitalism is an import into Romania, given the powers of Silicon Valley and these fantasies that it upholds, history is far more complex. And so, in other words, it's not only siliconization to blame for what's happening, although we also do need to look at that. But this has to take place alongside critiques of property violence and anti-communism. Nevertheless, Silicon Valley does transport Western understandings of racialization, with the whole of Eastern Europe rendered as backwards and requiring Western technological salvation in post-socialist times. It's also welcomed a proliferation of what are called digital nomads, arriving to the city, or like to cities such as Cluj, some self-described as digital gypsies. These are primarily Western tech workers who fantasize the freedom of remote labor attached to the security of Silicon Valley capital. Often they live in Airbnb units and look to take advantage of Romania's cheap labor compared to the West, although it's not cheap. It's fast internet, exploitable technology, and high English language proficiency. So divorced from Roma materialities and identities, digital nomad fantasies uphold the individualism and wanderlust of 19th century Orientalism, particularly the novellas and poems written mostly by white male authors who allegorize Western imperial deracination. Texts, for instance, Carmen here, exoticize the free and wandering gypsy, an alibi that, like today's digital nomad, abstracts and mutilates Roma experiences of dispossession. So today's digital nomads, I'm suggesting, really allegorize Silicon Valley imperialism and its desires by reproducing these fantasies of mobility, while the arrival of Western tech and Western tech workers often results in material racial dispossession. And so while today's digital redux updates 19th century imperial dreams, it also signals techno-imperialism's geographic anchor, which had been Western Europe during the time of a lot of these novellas and poems, to Silicon Valley. So yeah, so part of this project of Siliconization is thus one that updates post-Enlightenment fantasies of Westernization, with a prerequisite being racial banishment, while another part reinscribes Orientalism. Yet it's not only Silicon Valley futurity being dreamt. As we can see with property restitution, there's also a turning backwards to the pre-socialist past that smart city fantasies uphold. And it was in pre-socialist times, or Romania's golden era, that cities such as Bucharest were considered the little Paris of the East. Yet this was also a deeply fascistic time. And so it's interesting that today, while liberal proponents of anti-communist futurity and Siliconization enjoy the benefits of property restitution, it's interesting that their vision of this little Paris of the East gets recoded into this little Silicon Valley of the East, and that their vision restitutes the same golden era as a growing neo-fascist movement speaks to the kind of strange and often creepy bedfellows that anti-communism produces. And to give you an example of this, these are some photographs from the late revolution, which began in 2017 and 2018. They're largely anti-corruption protests that took over big squares in Romania and Bucharest and Cluj. And part of the idea was that by using light and Western technology, Romania could appeal to the West for salvation, to kind of save it from its the lingering ghosts of state socialism that continued to plague the states, the social democratic government, which is not socialist at all. But this kind of gets into the kind of ways that anti-communism and this idea of Western tech innovation go hand in hand and inform popular imaginaries today. And you can see, on some of these signs, just how this works and how, current leaders get likened to Marx and Lenin, while current leaders are not at all socialist. But the late revolution, while inspired by an array of uprisings, from fascist interwar movements to more recent heritage movement formations, which also seek to restitute a pre-socialist past. There have also been populist anti-corruption uprisings that have, for instance, following the deadly collective nightclub fire in 2015, also incentivized large street movements. But there was also the Save Russia Montana protests, which began in 2013, which began as anti-capitalist and anti-imperial in nature in order to fight back against this exploitative Canadian gold mining company, Gabriel Resources, which wanted to strip mine Romania's mountains for gold. And many early organizers spewed an explicitly anti-colonial framework and embraced international solidarity. Gabriel's founder had actually first laid the groundwork for his exploitations in Africa. But while this protest movement was successful in thwarting Gabriel, it became increasingly liberal throughout its tenure, effectively welcoming in some nationalists and white supremacists into its constituency to grow power. And this effectively ousted some anti-capitalist organizers and politics from the space of populist movement making. And so while we can see these reverberations in the late revolution, I'm suggesting we can also trace its specters into a mass movement that never transpired, that I often think about, that that could have or maybe still can, against Ikea. So there is no mass movement against Ikea, but this is me wishing that there was. But today, Romania contains about 70% of Europe's virgin forests. Much of the European continent was deforested during the industrial era, but this was less so in Romania. But a major wave of ecological destruction did take place after state socialism ended, and then another big wave right in 2005, correlating with property restitution and promises of EU integration. And this created a sort of liberated market for Western firms to exploit labor and resources. And so close to 2/3 of the country's forests have been lost to property restitution, and this kind of the astronomical growth of what's considered the fast furniture industry since then. And corruption, if we want to think about corruption, does come into play. About half of the timber harvested between 2013 and 2017 was conducted illegally, but the biggest benefactors aren't kind of small owners, but rather the Orthodox Church and multinational lumber companies and real estate mafia groups. But Ikea has been the largest winner by far, swallowing up huge swaths of forests from Harvard University, which had made kind of weird deals using faulty restitution schemas, and they thought they were going to get caught, and then handed all of their forests over to Ikea, which today owns forests in 21 counties in Romania. And Ikea, so it was founded in 1943 by Ingvar Kamprad, who was he basically joined Sweden's fascist socialist unity party the same year he founded Ikea. He was only 17 years old. And since then, Ikea has been in this state of expansion. It's it is the largest consumer of timber globally, devouring 2 million more trees to produce smart furniture each year, and 10% of that comes from Romania. But it also owns TaskRabbit, which is a startup gig economy company that was founded in San Francisco in 2008 by a former IBM software engineer in the name of revolutionizing the world's labor force. So TaskRabbit workers today perform an array of odd jobs for users, including assembling Ikea furniture. Yeah, in the world of movement making, Ikea's role in exploiting local forest worlds is not rendered as problematic as Gabriel's stake on Romanians' gold was during the Save Roșia Montana protests. Well, Greenpeace, as well as the Cluj-based Eco-Ruralis Association, have been actively fighting Ikea in courts. And while journalists have conducted important research uncovering its predations, some of whom have actually faced violence for doing this research, there's no mass movement aimed against the smart furniture monopoly locally. And I suggest this in part has to do with the aspirational status that Ikea bears in urban space, where smart furniture is read as a barometer of urban savviness. Ikea furniture, in the sense, becomes indexical of an affordable Western modernity for the many, some of whom take trips to the Ikea furniture stores in Romania. Others attend Ikea's catalog launches in bookstores. This is a bookstore in Bucharest where there was a catalog launch in 2018. But also, the company plays a significant role in the development of Bucharest tech office spaces, promising siliconization. So beginning in 2008, Ikea established the Interprime Properties Investment Fund with eyes fixed on Romanian socialist industrial sites to develop high-end office buildings. In 2014, it rebranded itself as Vastant after purchasing 53 square meters in a plot that was once Bucharest Timpernoi industrial platform and metalworks. Having lived nearby the complex for a couple of years, I witnessed the region's dramatic transformation. Often, as newer, fancier residential housing complexes sprung up, fast food trucks began appearing outside Bastant buildings during lunch. No longer do working class factory workers queue up for canteen meals, as had once been the case, but rather middle-class aspirational tech workers with lanyards and badges line up eager for boutique fast food. And so it's these sort of silicon aspirations that I'm suggesting in part explain why so few people have organized against forest defense, although other factors are also at play. While thousands continue to protest government corruption and communist ghosts. And so might it be that these anti-communist desires incarcerate real possibilities of dissent, ones necessary in combating a growing landscape marked by Silicon Valley imperialism, racial techno-capitalism, and techno-fascism alike. So in post-socialist times, these anti-communist forces inform not only gentrification and exploitation within Romania, but also Western fears of Eastern technological illiberalism. And this is also an important factor, I suggest. So today there are cities such as Romania, pathologized as Hackerville by the West, or the most dangerous town on the internet, rendered as seeping with hackers, threatening to dismantle liberal democracy. And so this is actually a film made by Norton Security, which is a Silicon Valley-based cybersecurity firm that also makes films, apparently. And this is a film where it's only 20 minutes long, but it is a film that rendered these dangerous hackers and scammers in Romania, like threatening to hack Western computers and users with their viruses. And so the idea is that a user should watch this film, which is really a piece of techno-capitalist propaganda, and then purchase Norton cybersecurity software to protect their computers from the internet's most dangerous town, which is the small mountain town in Romania. This deviant plot was not crafted by some Romanian hackers, but actually by Silicon Valley techno-capitalists. And elided from this film's analysis, it's how and why Romania gained computing prowess in the first place. So unbeknownst to many, Romania excelled in computer development during socialism, both through the state to advance the project of industrialization, also surveillance, but more interestingly, underground. In fact, Romania produced more third-generation computers than any other Eastern Bloc country, often by clandestinely cloning Western computer models. And this practice took place in homes and university computer labs, all sorts of places. And anti-communist projects of siliconization erased this history and its lingering present, but also how Western technology was used to instigate capitalist transition, whether through the anti-communist Radio Free Europe project or the biased television broadcasting of Romania's 1989 revolution, the first revolution televised. It was after 1989 that companies such as IBM actually came and Microsoft came rushing in to absorb Romania's computing workforce and co-opt Romanian workers and infrastructure. Think tanks, meanwhile, you can see a slide of one here on that side. I guess it's the left. Think tanks came rushing in to basically teach the merits of capitalism. And this is a slide from this British guy, Malcolm Punn, who came into Romania in 1995 to teach Romanian workers that there's no such thing as a free lunch. So this was the way that the West was going in to really make sure that capitalism prevailed. Interestingly, though, this was not the West's first incursion into Romania to sell its wares or ideas. In 1938 and 1941, electronic calculators were shipped to Romania by the Compania Electrocontabilă Watson, headquartered on Madison Avenue, which is actually IBM's home. So this was IBM. As it turns out, IBM's founder, Thomas Watson, had been making trips to Romania, Poland, and Germany at the time, selling machines that assisted in Romania the 1941 census, which was used to map out where Jews and Roma lived for extermination. So today, people might be more familiar with Watson through Watson AI, which is a supercomputer, and which famously won a Jeopardy game in San Francisco in 2011, mobilizing deep QA software architecture to merge natural language processing with its own structured information. The computer won by wagering the most money when a question was asked regarding Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. And so while Stoker wrote Dracula, without ever having traveled to Romania, and instead based it upon Gothic and Orientalist literary tropes of the time, the Watson AI supercomputer's namesake, Thomas Watson, of course, had been to Romania, during 1938 and 1941. And of course, the company then also rushed into Romania after 1989, absorbing the computing workforce and its factories, and effectively launching the project of becoming Silicon Valley by restituting a pre-socialist techno-fascist past. So to transition a little bit, so it was during this era of Watson AI winning Jeopardy in San Francisco, also the era of TaskRabbit forming and then eventually getting bought by Ikea in San Francisco, that I also had begun organizing against the gentrifying impacts of siliconization in the San Francisco Bay Area, a region now considered the quote unquote real Silicon Valley, but an area that hasn't always held this title. In fact, before the Cold War, the area was called the Valley of Heart's Delight, known for its orchards and its canneries, an industry that actually exploited a lot of immigrant labor and was environmentally toxic. And that relationship then got remapped upon Cold War electronics manufacturing. And so as the Cold War in California came into fruition, presaged by the 1947 National Security Act, a conglomerate of higher education, military defense, and scientific research began to gain funding, and silicon chips soon began to be produced, led by Stanford University, and soon enough the area became Silicon Valley. But it was after the Cold War ended that many of these companies, which were getting mostly just government support, needed to figure out a new business model. And this ushered in the dawn of consumer-based technologies for profit, and the personal computer, and soon internet-based technologies and companies. So a very different history than that of Romania. But this is where we can see the dot-com actually having emerged as these companies suddenly needed a new market. They rushed into San Francisco, and suddenly San Francisco became part of Silicon Valley too. And this is the title of a film that I really liked that came out in 2001 called Boom, The Sound of Eviction, but it's really about the dot-com boom's dispossessive impacts in San Francisco and all of the evictions that ensued as the dot-com boom led to newfound ways that realtors and real estate speculators were trying to gather tech capital and evict longtime residents and make money. The dot-com boom busted, and then the 2008 recession slowed the real estate market down. But then starting around 2010, 2011, this new tech boom 2.0 started, in which Airbnb and Uber launched, Twitter took over what had been a market, the public hospital became the Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital and Trauma Center, and even areas like West Oakland, which had been historically Black and working class, became branded this new edge of Silicon Valley. But of course, this area is also San Francisco and West Oakland, and before that had other names. So part of what I'm doing in this project is looking at how Silicon Valley itself is a fiction of sorts, one that even though it claims to be based in California, isn't really based anywhere at all, yet nevertheless materializes extreme violence. So for some context, this is the era in which I began organizing against evictions in San Francisco. One of the main points in our organizing early on with a group called Eviction Free San Francisco, which was a mutual aid direct action group, was against this phenomenon of Google buses, but basically private luxury transportation buses that were taking over public bus stops in order to transport workers to Silicon Valley from San Francisco. And Silicon Valley, it's about an hour south of San Francisco. And so these buses would take highly paid workers to Mountain View and Palo Alto and these different cities that comprise Silicon Valley. And one of the things we noticed was that evictions and rent started to increase in proximity to these bus stops, but also they were using public bus stops which was technically illegal, but they had a secret deal with the city to use these bus stops and transport workers. And so we started blockading them to call attention to the gentrifying impacts of big tech in the city. There was another phenomenon involving the Mission Playground, which is a big playground in the Mission, in which Airbnb and Dropbox workers decided to have a private soccer match, and they used this new app that was only available to tech workers at the time to reserve what had been a public playground and basically play a private game. And in doing so, they tried to kick off these youth, most of whom are youth of color, from the playground so that they could have their Dropbox versus Airbnb match. So there's this new kind of co-optation of public space that we started to see, whether it was the Google buses or the Mission Playground. And so what I'm interested in here is how in this tech boom 2.0, where sharing economies and hacker playgrounds prosper, companies nevertheless go out of their way to avoid paying for public goods. And what I find interesting is how a liberal fervor undergirded by sharing protracts the techno-capitalist imperative to deracinate socialist projects and imaginaries, for instance, the commons for profit. And so as Neda Tanasowski and Kalindi Vora suggest, sharing economy discourse has appropriated socialist conceptions of collaboration and sharing to further the development of capitalist exploitation. This is why they suggest that post-socialism as an analytic needs to apply beyond a formerly state socialist space to really think about how anti-capitalist ideas more generally get co-opted by capitalism. But despite this, the youth pictured here fought back. One of them is the son of a member of the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, in fact. They created this video that went viral and mobilized media and technology in new ways. And they actually successfully won and got the city to retract this app that it had given these Dropbox dudes and Airbnb tech bros, and won their right back to effectively play in public space. And I'm mentioning that as the way that I begin to trace in this book, the project of Unbecoming Silicon Valley, one of many ways. And so with that, I'm going to turn to this illustration. It's a screen print by artist, activist, a friend of mine, Fernando Martí. He had been prompted to reflect upon the commons in San Francisco, yet was troubled by the liberal conceptual communist frameworks deracinated from stolen native land. As he reflects, here in San Francisco, where I live and work, I'm constantly aware of the development and modern city being built on stolen land, the rising new skyscrapers downtown that are built over an erasure of history. So while portraying this history of dispossession, Martí also depicts native plants, a California condor, and Ohlone. Ohlone are the native people to the Bay Area. Ohlone canoeists traversing the bay with siliconized city skyline, the siliconized city skyline blocked out in the background. And so this refusal of silicon overdetermination and a deracinated understanding of the commons was first conceptualized for him in collaboration with the Segorite Land Trust. They're an indigenous feminist-led land trust, and their ongoing project is one of decolonizing and commoning, along with what their co-founder, Karina Gold, describes as the renatriation of culture, which has been withering away for over 250 years, not only by Spanish missionaries, Mexico, and then the US, but also by contemporary gentrification. Through their work, Silicon Valley itself becomes rendered an imperial fiction, one that maps upon prior colonial toponymies, such as San Francisco and San Jose, which are also fictions, and distort and erase place names such as Tamyan, Chochenyo, Ramaitush, and other places that still are this area that we sometimes now call Silicon Valley or San Francisco. And so this map here, unlike Google's, comes from a collaborative project done with Indigenous elders that I was a part of through the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project, which is another project I'm a part of, alongside a number of land and housing justice-based groups committed to collectively undoing the violent fantasies of siliconization on this stolen land. And this comes from an atlas that we produced and published in 2021 with over 150 community partners in the Bay Area. And the atlas is called Counterpoints with PM Press. But a lot of what we do today is produce tools such as a Victor book. This is just a screenshot of the Victor book. The idea here has been to use data and maps and software, basically to create software that can be used to fight against displacement and gentrification. So this is a lookup tool. You can look up an address, figure out who the landlord is and what other addresses they might own, and use this to engage in multi-building solidarity and rent strikes against landlords. You can also figure out what their kind of corporate connections are. This is just one example of what it means to sort of reappropriate in the spirit of counter-cartography, which comes out of indigenous practices to fight back against siliconization. So just as housing justice and anti-imperial organizing crack open the veneer of siliconization here, similar work is at place in Romania, albeit differently. So today, much of the outsourcing firms scattered upon Romanian cities sit upon the exoskeletons of former industrial and factory buildings, despite siliconized fantasies of novelty and socialist erasure. The predation requisite for becoming siliconized is only possible because of socialist infrastructure. Many of these firms scattered about urban centers rely upon un-Siliconized forms of knowledge production, much of which continue to grow underground following state socialism's demise. Due to a combination of austerity and a sense of what's called șmecheria, which is a Romanian word with Romani roots, inferring a sort of slyness or ingenuity. People continue to clone computers and Skillshare techno practices in magazines, chat rooms, and more, often creating hardware to house free software independent from expensive Microsoft operating systems. Soon youth began to wire neighborhoods with independent internet networks to avoid corporate costs and pirate otherwise expensive software and media. And the remnants of some of these networks remain today. While much of the early 2000s hacking was done to foster sociality and save money amidst a brutal disaster capitalist economy, some hackers did more overtly espouse anti-imperial politics, akin to what Jovan Scott Lewis formulates as reparative scamming. Some of this informed the formation of groups like Chata, which exists today and is dedicated to refabricating computers to operate free of corporate and surveillance-based software. There's still, though, a lot to be done to grow these spaces into more anti-capitalist, feminist, and anti-racist frameworks and organizing taking place on the ground, but seeds do get planted. And I'm actually thinking of here of a project that Beda led alongside her colleague and comrade Mircea Nicolae, Istoria nu se repetă, or History Does Not Repeat Itself, in which participants, including myself very briefly, attempted to create a speculative history of Romania, and you can ask Beda more about this, imagining what might have been possible in the 1990s had workers been able to keep Western capitalism at bay. And part of this meant imagining and fabricating objects that could have been part of such an anti-capitalist techno future. And in the workshop I went to, we actually thought about a free school where hacking could be taught alongside feminist and Roma feminism and queer organizing. So this could help avert the sort of cultures today where a lot of this free and open source software is still very white and male. But the question remains, what might it mean to materialize these futures today, and what work can we draw upon, and what can we learn from the past to imagine techno futures yet to come? And then, of course, part of the project of Unbecoming Silicon Valley in Romania is the ongoing work of organizing against gentrification. So in Bucharest, there's the FCDL, or the Common Front for Housing Rights, which Beda and Michaela have been a part of. And they've been fighting evictions for years. In Cluj, there's the Casa Socială Acum, or Social Housing Now, which largely got animated or reanimated after that eviction to Hotărât to the in 2010 that I mentioned when Nokia came in, and which continues to fight evictions and advocate for social housing against smart city predation today. There are also coalitions such as the Bloc in Romania, which bring anti-gentrification activists Roma feminists, and also worker unions together, which Veta spoke about on Tuesday. And to me, this is actually perhaps one of the most promising genres of Unbecoming Silicon Valley, as it brings together racial, spatial, and labor justice to create worlds beyond those of just possession and exploitation. And together, all of these collectives, but also speculations and visions, are part of the larger project then of becoming Unbecoming Silicon Valley. And at the end of the day, all of these are committed to materializing futures beyond those of techno-dystopics and dispossessions, looking to futures past and present that mediate other ways of thinking, living, and being. So I wanted to conclude with something that, again, kind of like the Ikea protest that hasn't come to be, an act of solidarity and organizing that maybe isn't quite here yet, but that I think is maybe on the horizon and that I'm especially interested in. So during a lot of my research in Romania, I was interviewing people who worked in outsourcing firms, and there are many outsourcing firms in cities like Cluj and Bucharest. One of the outsourcing firms that I was actually talking to a friend unrelated to research at all, and she mentioned she was working in an outsourcing firm for this company called Yardi. I was like, what, Yardi? Turns out Yardi is one of the biggest what are called prop tech or virtual property management companies in the world. They formed in 1985 in California. They expanded dramatically after 2008 and are actually used to manage properties for big landlord corporations like Invitation Homes, Blackstone. Some of the biggest landlords in the world use Yardi to virtually manage its properties. This was needed when corporate landlords suddenly scaled at a kind of newfound scales and needed help in order to manage tens of thousands of property. They wanted to turn to kind of magical virtual property management. But as we know, in work that looks at tech labor, nothing happens magically. Instead, a lot of people are working the night shifts in companies like Yardi to basically power this property management software that, unfortunately, a lot of poor and working class tenants need to use in order to rent their homes or even be considered for a home to rent in the US. And interestingly, before even talking to this friend who worked for Yardi, I had made maps with the anti-eviction mapping project of properties owned by Invitation Homes and Blackstone in California. And then I started to realize, wait, a lot of these properties are using this property management software that now I know some friends of mine in Romania actually work for. And you know, some folks, you know, their shift might start at 2 a.m. even, and they're answering the phones for US tenants who think that their landlords are local. But due to kind of the opaque network of property ownership that now is very common when it comes to corporate landlordism, people don't actually know who their landlords are, never mind who's answering the phone when they call because their stove is broken or something like that. And so this got me really interested in this emerging space of what's called prop tech or property technology. I began calling it landlord technology because I think that better signals who benefits and who kind of arbitrates the use of this technology. And so I started looking into it more. In 2019, there were some high-profile cases of landlord technology being used basically to intentionally evict tenants and to gather biometric data about them in New York City. Some of this had actually begun as early as 2013. But New York City in particular has been this kind of experimental playground of the prop tech industry, particularly because it's been this epicenter of the real estate industry for a really long time. But what's happening is a lot of low income and affordable housing units in New York, many of which are home to predominantly people of color, are basically having facial recognition technology installed without their consent, and people are being forced to scan their faces in order to enter their own homes. They have to give up their keys and instead basically have their faces scanned. And scholars who work on AI and its racial and gendered biases know that these technologies are actually trained predominantly on white male faces and are very bad at recognizing the faces of people of color or people who aren't white hetero cis men. And so this technology is not only very faulty, tenants don't know where any of the data that's being collected about them goes. Many worry that it goes to the police or to ICE. And so I began this project called Landlord Tech Watch, which produces popular educational materials and also public scholarship related to this new industry. And what we try to do is produce work that can help explain how these systems work and what can be done to fight back. And so we produced brochures and pamphlets, reports, et cetera, that get used in organizing against landlord technology, but in local contexts. And at the end of the day, this project seeks to abolish landlord technologies altogether, and also landlordism and the cycles of housing precarity and carcerality that they reproduce. But what I'm wondering about here, and this is how I'm going to leave everything off today, but what would such an abolitionist approach to landlord technology look like in post-socialist contexts and in imperial contexts? So for one, in places like the US, it would heed calls from housing movement organizers to cancel rent and repatriate stolen land. But in Romania, it would also mean dismantling the surrogate forms of labor that dehumanize Romanian call center workers and exploit their technologies. It would undo the very concept of landlordism itself for the conditions in a world in which tenant lives, data, and homes, and also tenant forms of labor can be possessed and profited upon, constitutes the very bedrock of racial capitalism, a practice that goes back to feudal Eastern Europe and the exploitation of slave labor and technologies that began then. So just as global capital connections map the Siliconizing moment, other connections scaffold the very possibilities of unbecoming Silicon Valley. So it's precisely the space of collective alliance making, organizing, and dreaming of a world in which property no longer functions as a technology of dispossession, that for me, the very project of Siliconization begins to unravel. But of course, there remains a lot to be done to grow worker and tenant solidarities, especially transnationally, against the dispossessions wrought by racial techno-capitalism and Siliconization alike. I'm hopeful that anti-imperial connections are already here, and ones that seek to undo the fantasy of Silicon Valley and craft space for other techno-imaginaries and materialities to emerge. And so with that, I'm going to end, and I look forward to any questions or comments. I know that was like a lot of stuff, so that's what I got.
The recording of. Okay, I'm just going to stop the recording now. Yeah, great. I am sure